What a song. Made me want to dance. Fortunately for you, we're not zoned for such things, so it won't happen. But wow, Mr. Blakey, and it's scriptural too. So thank you very much. I'm awake and will endeavor to keep you so also. When I wake up on Sabbath, one of the things I pray, and when I say I pray, it's not always on my knees, it's just a general plea to God and the universe is, please don't let people talk about viruses today or politics. And I have to say, my prayers have been answered, but today I'm going to expose myself as one of the church's biggest hypocrites because I don't usually tell you where I'm going. I expect you to come on the journey and follow along, but I think it's only sporting to tell you today that I am talking about viruses. I'm not talking about the virus, I'm talking about viruses with a little v. And I only have 2 points today, although you may wonder as we go along. My first point is that God made viruses. I mean, he made everything that was made. There was nothing that was made without him. And the more you know about them, the more magnificent God's creation becomes. So that is my first goal, is to show you how viruses sing the glories of God. They really do, and that we can't have life without them. Second, I feel very strongly that viruses can actually teach us something about how God works. And I'm not just talking about generalizations. I'm talking about what might be a startling insight into the nuts and bolts of how he created the world. So let's get going. There's a lot of information, and I will try to keep Rachel Shirk in mind. Rachel Shirk hasn't been with us for many years. She died decades ago. She was part of the Cleveland West Church, and we were very good friends, but sometimes we did refer to ourselves as our worthy adversaries because we were always in very good nature and love, we were always arguing. That's what we were always doing. But Rachel Shirk was a woman of God and a very strong-minded woman, and I still think of her like I think of my parents in some situations, and I just can still hear her saying, oh no, not science again. Because for some people that's a big turnoff, and I understand that. So this is more, stories and popular science and just general information about viruses. I will try not to keep it complicated. For one thing, I'm an amateur. I mean, I'm not a virologist or whatever they are. I'm not one. And furthermore, in keeping it simple, I will be oversimplifying some things. And if there's anybody listening to this, either now or in the future when it's recorded, and you find something that I've said that's wrong, I would love to hear from you. I really would. I've tried very hard to have everything be totally accurate, but there's a possibility that I could be mistaken about something. And so I truly, I want to get this right. Viruses are kind of the darling of scientific research in the 21st century, and there's a good reason for that. We haven't known about them that long, and we haven't had the technology to see them in detail for that long. A lot of what we know about viruses has been discovered in the last 20 years. In 1983, British biologist Peter Medawar wrote in a book, "No virus is known to do good. It has been said that a virus is a piece of bad news wrapped up in protein." And I think many of us, feel that from our heart at this point. But we have found out that that is not true. It is true that there's no point to viruses unless they're allowed to make their homes in other organisms. There's no point to a virus. That's what they do. They infect. But there's a very interesting article, which I'll give you more detailed information about in this month's National Geographic. It's wonderful. For one thing, there's fantastic pictures in it because we now have equipment where we can take pictures of virus, and the pictures are incredible. I was going to share some of them today, and then I thought, well, they're copyrighted pictures in a major publication, and it's something you can find easily online. So I encourage you, I'll give you that exact information before I'm done. But the title of the article in National Geographic, which I encourage you to read because it's written for the general population, is how viruses shape our world. But the line under that is they kill us by the millions, but without them, life is impossible. And that's true. They play an incredible part in keeping life going on this earth. And you know, in Romans 14 and verse 17, it says that the kingdom of God is not food and drink. Well, the kingdom of God is not viruses. The kingdom of God is not science and nature and things like that. Although they, what's the biblical phrase? They do redound to the glory of God. And I want you to know that no matter what you hear today, because some of this is yeah, it is. And it's just that you and I do believe the same things. I believe in keeping the commandments of God. I believe in God's plan. I believe in keeping the holy days. I believe in salvation. I believe in his coming kingdom. We agree on all those things. So if there's things that you're not too sure of, I just ask you to come along for the ride, because I think the payoff is pretty big towards the end. You know, when Jesus spoke, his audience didn't talk about viruses. He knew about them, but he didn't talk about them because nobody had any concept of what they were. They knew what diseases were, and they knew what plagues were. And Greg had a good point last week that some of the plagues that we read about in the Bible are almost certainly viruses, because they spread through the air and they spread quickly. And that's viruses. That's what viruses are known for doing. Now, you know, when it comes to time for the historic Passover, of course, there had to be somebody instructing them to infect only the firstborn and not, you know, the doors. So there is some divine intervention going on in there. But like you read the plague after David did a census of the armies of Israel, and it spreads through people. And when the plague, when God stopped it, you know, he stopped it at a particular place. I mean, it was that clear. And that was probably a virus, because that's what viruses do. The first question would be, what is a virus? And it is a dab of genetic material. And I'm going to use the terms DNA and RNA a bit, and I'm going to assume that you've heard them before. And DNA is protein material. It's in the cells of animals and plants, of living things, and it encodes genetic information. It's the recipe for life. Your physical person is defined by your DNA. One half came from one parent and one half came from another parent. It's in your chromosomes. It turns out it's not quite that simple when it comes to viruses, but they are either DNA-based or RNA-based. And in our cells, DNA has all the instructions in it. It has our genetic makeup. It has, you know, that I have blue eyes and whatever color hair this is. That's due to my DNA. But my DNA in the cells, there's another molecule called RNA, and RNA takes its instructions from DNA. It's very similar to DNA. There's correlations. And then RNA makes proteins that makes all the things that happen in life. And so DNA, when I talk about DNA, it's just the recipe for that organism. It's a code, but it's written in proteins. It's not written on paper and bound in a book. Sometimes I wonder if one of God's books of life, because there are plural books of life mentioned in the Bible, if one of them isn't just a recipe book, you know, for everything that he's come up with, that he could create and recreate, that you know, if in the world tomorrow God decides we're going to have passenger pigeons and ivory-billed woodpeckers again, he has the recipe recorded somewhere. And it would be, again, not written in words, but it would be written in protein. So in some ways, DNA is the book of life. It is the recipe for all living things. Well, you just take a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of DNA, or RNA, could be either, and you put a protein code around it that's called a capsid, and you've probably heard that term with the COVID virus. And sometimes there's another envelope around that. And how many of you, could I just ask, how many of you have seen pictures of coronavirus and have some concept of what it looks like? I think most of you have. It's roughly ball-shaped, but on the outside of it, there's all these little spikes, and they're what help it grab on to other cells and actually break into those cells. And that's that coating, that's that other envelope that helps it catch and hold on to a cell. As a matter of fact, that's where coronavirus gets its name, and coronaviruses weren't named recently. They were named in the 1960s by a scientist named June Almeida, a woman who thought that coronaviruses, they're all, the common cold is a coronavirus, and SARS is a coronavirus, there's other ones, and they are round and they have those little spikes all over them. I've seen dog toys made in that shape. And the dogs can rip the spikes off, they're Velcro, and then you can put them back on. So somebody's making money off a coronavirus shape. But she thought that it looked like an eclipse of the sun, where the moon is in front of the sun and you see the outer ring shining around the moon. And she thought that the form of a coronavirus looked like that. And that's where the term corona comes from. That's why we have it. It's not named after a beer, it's named after a solar eclipse. The size varies. There are big ones that you can see with regular microscopes, and I don't think there's any that are big enough to see without magnification. But there are ones that are relatively huge. But for instance, when it comes to the coronavirus, 10 trillion of them would fit in a raindrop. 10 trillion. I didn't even know what trillion was when I was a kid. It wasn't, I think Congress invented the term, frankly. Trillions weren't used. It was millions and then it was billions. But there have 10 trillion coronaviruses would fit in a raindrop, which is one reason that it's such a formidable challenge. They're so small and they disperse so freely. People knew about the diseases that virus caused, smallpox, rabies, all the different influenzas, colds, but people didn't know what they were caused by. A few hundred years ago, when the microscope was invented, we began to be able to see one-celled microorganisms. But even then, we eventually could see bacteria, and we could see little fungus cells and other things, but we still could not see viruses. And it was actually thought that well, the first identified virus was the tobacco mosaic virus. And if you're a gardener, that can affect you because tobacco mosaic virus can affect your tomatoes and peppers. And it also affected the tobacco crop in this country, which was a big moneymaker. It still is, but back when smoking was even more common, the tobacco virus was a big threat to the tobacco industry. So it was one of the first ones that was identified, but all they knew is that it could spread from sap. It could spread from the juice of one plant to another plant, but they couldn't see anything, even under microscopes, that would actually spread it. And so there was a Dutch scientist who named this a contagious living fluid. Well, that's a little long. So it got shortened to a variant of the Latin word for poison, and that is virus. Virus means poison, or I mean, that's the etymology of it. Then in the 20th century, scientists found that viruses were the cause of diseases that affected humans and every other form of life, really. There's a huge group of viruses that infect only bacteria, and they refer to those as phages, P-H-A-G-E-S. And they're an interesting study. For decades, viruses remained invisible. And, you know, that's no problem for us. We believe in invisible things. In Romans, you know, it talks about the invisible things of God. Well, for most of mankind's journey on Earth, viruses have been one of those invisible things. But then electron microscopes were invented in the 1930s, and as they were perfected, we began to be able to see the shapes. And if you can find pictures of virus shapes, they look like science fiction, but they're real. One of the first ones to be seen was the tobacco mosaic virus, and it looks like pipes piled on top of each other, smoking pipes. Phages are some very interesting looking bacteria. They look like lunar modules. They have a ball up top, and then there's a trunk that goes down, and then at the bottom, there's these spidery legs, 6 or 8, or, you know, the number varies. But that lands on a bacteria and those legs grab like something from the War of the Worlds. And that's a picture that's worth finding if you can, a bacteriophage and what they look like. There are serpent-shaped viruses. There are soccer ball-shaped ones. And of course, we've talked about what the coronavirus looks like. There are many, many different kinds. And you know, the human tendency when we look at the vast variety of life is to put them into a tree, you know, to have branches for the birds and the lizards and the mammals. You can't do that with viruses. And one scientist said it's more like a bunch of bushes, really. It's not a family tree in that there's groups of them. There's huge ones, there's coronaviruses, there's phages, but it's difficult for them to actually be classified. For one reason, organisms are often classified by where they appeared in the sequence of life appearing on Earth, and we just don't know that about viruses. One big question is, are we alive? Are they alive? I hope you know if you're alive. Are viruses alive? Well, that's a hard question because then you have to define what alive is. And it's funny, it's one of those things that we use the term and we know what we mean, but there isn't really a good definition for life. You know, there's not a good definition for light. There's not a good definition for love. There's not a good definition for God. There's all kinds of things that we know what they are, but we can't specifically define them. Even things like electricity we know a great deal about it, but it's hard to just specifically define it. And so are they alive? Well, not really. They don't eat, they don't metabolize, and they don't really do anything until they find a living cell. And, you know, I've just made it difficult because I use the word living, but that brings them to life. They can be disabled. It was found with the tobacco Mosaic virus that you could freeze it and crystallize it. You could do what you thought was killing it. But then a year later, you could bring it back to life and revive it, and it was just as infectious as it was before. However, there was something that they did find out, which was when you radiated with X-rays, you know, when they try to produce mutations in fruit flies, for instance, sometimes they will radiate them with X-rays, and you'll get new generations of fruit flies that have different color eyes or wings that are a different shape or things like that. Well, it was found out that if tobacco virus was irradiated by X-rays, that it could no longer infect tobacco plants, sometimes. You know, if the DNA changed. And it turns out that in viruses, the DNA can change quite quickly. And that's one of the troubles we're facing with the coronavirus, of course, is there's new variants all the time. Before our eyes, we just can't see it. But, you know, it's in the news every day that there's a new variant. But what was found out about that is that they have genes, that they do have RNA and that they have DNA. And it was previously thought that that was only in living things. Humans have about 20,000 genes. It varies in viruses, but it's usually a pretty small number because they're very small things. COVID has 29 genes. It has more proteins than that, but it only has 29 genes, and some viruses only have 10. And that's like, you know, driving a smart car after you're used to a Lincoln Continental. It's really streamlined down. There is a researcher in France who proposes that we're thinking of viruses the wrong way, that they're alive when they're inside a cell and active in the cell, in the same way that an acorn is just a seed, but when it's alive, it's an oak tree. And you wouldn't necessarily, if it was your first day on Earth and you saw an acorn and you saw an oak tree, you wouldn't necessarily think that they were the same thing. Well, his point is that maybe we're thinking about it the same way, that a virus is like a seed and it's dormant, but when it goes into a cell, it's that combination of the cell and the virus that makes them a living thing. Trust me, they will be arguing about that forever because, again, they can't come up with the definition of is it alive. But it is important to understand that if you want to understand how wonderful viruses can be. There are a lot of viruses. There was a British geneticist, I think his name was J.R. Haldane, and he's famous for saying, he gave a talk to a bunch of theologians about his work, about biology and creation and things like that. And at the end, one of the theologians asked the question, well, what have you learned about God from all your studies? And he said, well, he's inordinately fond of beetles. And what he meant by that was, there's 20,000 species of mammals, there's 300,000 species of beetles. So he later changed that to say he's fond of stars and beetles because he didn't want to get too blasphemous there. But God, apparently does like beetles. And even more than that, he must have a mad obsession with viruses because you can't imagine how many viruses there are. You can't number them. If we could count them all up, they would outnumber all cell-based life forms on Earth. There are 100 billion viruses in 1 liter, 1 pop container of ocean water. 100 billion in a liter in the whole ocean. Somebody came up with the figure that there is 1 nonillion. Well, a nonillion doesn't mean anything to me. I don't know if it means something to you, but it's a 1 with 30 zeros after it. And you get to a certain point where it just doesn't mean anything. I can understand hundreds because occasionally I'll see a $100 bill. I have concepts of what thousands of dollars are, but you get up to billions, trillions, I lose it. I just know they're big numbers, and suffice it to say, it's a big number. There's a lot of viruses in the world. Where did they come from? Well, the simple answer is God made them. They're on Earth, so we know that God made them. But we don't really know because there aren't fossilized viruses. They're just too small. At least we haven't been able to see any. And there's a few theories that maybe viruses were the earliest form before what we call real life, or that they are cells that have streamlined themselves down, that have gotten rid of all the extravagant trappings and become as small as they can be. Or that they came from cells' genetic material, that they're like escape pods. And there are reasons to think that. How do they work? Well, a living cell, the cells in your body, or maybe you've seen it under a microscope in high school biology, cells want to split in two. When we have families, we call that reproducing, but your cells also reproduce in your body by splitting in two. Viruses can't do that. They can't eat, as I said, they can't get rid of waste, they can't reproduce. But they enter cells for one reason. They commandeer the 3D printing technology that's inside your cells, the DNA and RNA, and they use it to make multiple copies of themselves. That's their purpose. That's success for a virus. If you ask a virus what makes you happy, a virus will tell you when I enter a cell and make 1 million copies of myself. That's virus satisfaction for you. And in the process, of course, they destroy the cell. That's the problem. That's why viruses are so deadly. If it's a nerve cell, it can be very quick. If it's a blood cell, it's still quick, but not as quick. But there's different ways that they work. And it's why people lose their sense of smell when they get the COVID virus, because the virus enters the epithelial cells in their nasal passages and uses them to Xerox out copy after copy after copy of themselves, destroys the cells, and when they're done, you can't smell, and the virus doesn't care one bit. People do get their sense of smell back. I actually lost my epithelial cells from a bad case of influenza a few years ago, and it took years for them to come back, and I couldn't taste or smell for a long time, and I'm still not sure that I'm on the same level that I used to be. But that's why that happens. There is another scenario, though, and it's a very weird one and a very important one. And that's that a virus goes into the cell with the idea of reproducing itself, making copies of itself over and over and over again. But it does something different. It slips its small amount of genetic material into the DNA of the host cell. And then it stays there, and it stays there for a little while. And then in times of stress, there are things that might trigger the virus to start reproducing. But when the virus sneaks in and plants its information inside a cell, that's where things start to get strange. Are viruses bad or good? Well, let me read a list of virus names for you. Polio, rabies, Ebola, measles, mumps, influenza, HIV, dengue, Zika, yellow fever, herpes, hantavirus, which affects piano tuners more than anybody else. Long story, we can talk about it later. Chickenpox, hepatitis, shingles, common cold, smallpox, and of course, the COVID virus. And when you read that list, you think viruses are bad. But it's like fire. Fire can be bad, but fire can also be good, and fire can also be helpful. We say that viruses are parasites, but there might be a better word for it in some cases, and that might be symbiosis, where two kinds of things come together and benefit each other. And yes, the virus can't live without the other thing, but sometimes it can help. For instance, in the oceans, as mentioned, there's an incredible number of phages of viruses that attack bacteria. Phages invade microbe hosts in the ocean. I mean, of course, this is estimated, no one counted it, 100 billion trillion times a second. They kill 15 to 40% of the bacteria in the ocean every day. And you may wonder, well, you know, isn't that bad? Well, out of those shredded bacteria, the nutrients go into the ocean and are available for phytoplankton and other microorganisms. And so it's a way of distributing food around the ocean. But the other thing is that if viruses didn't do that, if you dived into the ocean, it would be jelly. It would be filled with bacteria. And eventually they would accumulate, particularly at the top of the ocean. There was a comic one time about diving into a pool filled with Jell-O, and I always wondered what that would feel like. I always thought that would be a cool thing. And maybe it's still in my future, who knows? But it could have happened with the ocean if it were not for viruses. Some of the viruses carry genes that enable photosynthesis to take place. And when they infect an organism, they give that organism the ability to photosynthesize, to be able to take light and make food out of it. And so the infected microbes do a better job of harnessing sunlight at that point. And so some of the oxygen that you breathe, the viruses have to get the credit for it because they made those nutrients available, and the photosynthesis and the oxygen is a byproduct of that. So viruses help us breathe. Our guts, and when I say ours, I mean you. Your guts are home to trillions of viruses when you're in perfect health. They keep your inner wilderness in balance, again, by destroying other microorganisms. It's thought that, that it keeps any one microorganism from dominating at that point. Now, I said that there are weird things that viruses do, and that's just about the only way you can describe them. And I want to talk about two instances. These are very specific instances. And one is a kind of wasp. This wasp is called Cotesia congregata. You may forget that. Just remember that it's a wasp. What this wasp does, and in biology class we learned this and I loved it because at that age I thought gory things were interesting. The wasp lays eggs inside a living caterpillar, and then the eggs eat the inside of the caterpillar and eventually, turn into insects and crawl out of the caterpillar. Well, that's disgusting, and I thought it was wonderful at the time. But part of the story is, if a wasp lays an egg in another organism, organisms have antibodies that would normally reject those eggs. Just like if you were to get a transplant, we have to worry about your body rejecting that transplant. Well, in a normal situation, the caterpillar would reject those eggs and get them out of its body in some way. But it turns out that those eggs are covered with a virus, and this virus keeps those antibodies from working. The fascinating thing about this virus is that it's part of the wasp's own code, part of the wasp's own DNA. And it doesn't exist as a virus till the wasp lays an egg, and then its virus is on the outside of the egg. So, are we talking about two different organisms? Are we talking about a wasp and a virus? They're both in the same code. Are we talking about one? It reminds me of what we teach about God and his very being, in that it's a simple subject, but it's also a complicated subject. We know that there's an entity we refer to as God the Father. There's an entity we refer to as Jesus Christ or his Son. And we know that they're one, but we also know that they're two. Well, this wasp is like that. They're one, but they're two. But even more, the other analogy is that this wasp sends out the virus, even though the virus came from the wasp's own DNA. And when this virus is out there, it's operating on behalf of the wasp. And that reminds me, in some ways, of God's own Holy Spirit, which is not a person, but still it comes from God. And when you're talking about the totality of God, you have to talk about his Holy Spirit, which is in people to whom he gives it. And so it's an interesting analogy that way. And it, as I said, it just shows you how magnificent the whole thing is and how complicated it is and how little we understand about the whole thing. I think even more fascinating is a study that was done in Penn State in 2005. And this to me was incredible. And they were injecting viruses into rats, because I guess that's what scientists do. They were trying to cure diseases in rats, and they were injecting genetic material in the form of virus to attack some of these diseases. You would think that that's backwards, but whatever, they were doing it. And they found out that this virus inserted its DNA into the rat's own genetic code. And where it was injected into the rats, then those cells would multiply. It didn't immediately reproduce and destroy the cells. It hid its DNA in those cells. And then when those muscle cells reproduced, the rats became measurably stronger. They became stronger and had way more stamina. It was incredible. And this was not expected. It wasn't something that they were expecting a virus to be able to do. And when it was publicized, and I'm sure you all remember reading about it, when it was publicized, the concern was that athletes would get a hold of it and misuse it. And I'm sitting there thinking, why are we concerned about athletes misusing it? The incredible thing is that we can change the genetic makeup of an animal by inserting viruses into them. And this is very important. If you were to do that to a sperm cell, there's no children here. No, that's Josie. She's just little. There's no children here. So I can say sperm cells and egg cells, and not blush about it. But if the viruses were to become part of them, then it would change future generations. And this is incredible. It's like winning the lottery. It's like what Mr. Thomas talks about when he says when he was born in America, he feels like he won the lottery. Well, a virus would feel like it won the lottery if it could inject its DNA into a cell that became part of future generations, a sperm or an egg. Viruses have played a role in the development of life. And at this point, I want to make some things clear. I believe that God created Adam and Eve not that long ago. One of the reasons I believe that is Jesus Christ clearly believed it. And I believe that's part of his story. But before Genesis 1 and before the story of the earthly Garden of Eden, there was a whole story of life that stretched out over billions and billions of years. We've always been encouraged to believe that because we believe that in Genesis 1 and verse 2, it talks about the earth becoming without form and void, and we don't really know what happened before then. But when I say we don't really know, we do have a clear fossil record. The fossil record is really clear. I've showed you I carry an ammonite fossil in my pocket. It's teeny, so you can't see it out there, but it's to remind me, these don't exist. There are no ammonites alive on Earth. But at some point in the Earth's history, these played a major part in the marine ecosystem of life. And if God made everything, then that was his doing. So before Adam and Eve were created, I want to be very careful. I'm not using the word evolution, which I know is a button-pushing word. I'm not using that, but let's just say that there was a sequence of life. There was times when the ammonites existed and dinosaurs did not exist. Then a later time, there were dinosaurs. I think everybody accepts that they existed. At later times, there were other organisms, saber-toothed tigers that don't exist today. And there was a march of life. And somewhere near the end, the hominids appeared that looked a lot like what Adam and Eve finally looked like when God made them. And so there is a sequence of life back there. And it's not really something we can argue with unless you say, well, God lied in the fossil record. And we know God doesn't do that. So he left us that fossil record to know what was going on back then. And one of the things I look forward to in God's kingdom after Jesus returns is the classes on what really happened back then, because I think they'll be fascinating. And he can hold up the fossils, or he can recreate what the organisms were like in those days. And I think it's going to be so exciting. But remember that when God makes things, sometimes we think of him with his tools, with his screwdrivers and saws and hammers and nails, making things. Well, the way God makes living things is he works in proteins. That's his recipe. Somehow he comes up with the code, with the recipe, and somehow he encourages, he makes it so that nutrients are fed into that and they develop, and then you have an organism. I mean, we have reason to think that's why he made Adam. You know why we have reason to think it? Because that's how he makes people today. That there's the seed, and I mean, sometimes we even call it a seed, and he has created something called a womb. And in this womb, nutrients are fed to this little thing, and it grows and develops because the proteins tell it what to do. And, you could argue that mom and dad made that creation, but God made it. I mean, God designed it. It wouldn't happen if it wasn't for God. Well, God deals in proteins. And when he made dinosaurs, he made dinosaur proteins. When he made ammonites, he made ammonite proteins and grew them from there. That's why it talks about making Adam from the dust of the ground. He had the code, and then he needed the raw materials. It doesn't mean he took slabs of clay. It means he took the nutrients that were floating around a destroyed earth at that point and used them to make Adam. So when I talk about things that happened before Adam, I want you to know that we're on the same page. We end up at the same place. But as I said, viral DNA shows up in chromosomes, and it looks like over history, and this is a complicated subject, but it's a very important one. This is one of the big deals of this information, is that you can look at human genes, the genetic code, and bear in mind, we couldn't do that till the end of the 20th century. So it's been waiting there all this time for us to look at, and you can see where viruses injected viral DNA into the code over time. It's almost identical. And some of these are called HERVs, H-E-R-V. I can't remember what the H-E stands for. RV stands for retrovirus, but they're part of our makeup. 8% of your chromosomes are that kind of material. It looks like they came from a virus. Now, if you don't believe that, it's still 8% of your chromosomes that come from that. It doesn't matter whether you believe it or not. It's the way that it is. These show up in our genomes and the genomes of other creatures too. The vast minority of viral DNA in our chromosomes is silent. It doesn't seem to do a thing. We don't know what it does. But some of them have new uses. And when you find out what they are, they're quite spectacular. And again, feel free to take a nap at this point or disagree with me, but this seems to be the way it is. This was discovered at the Pasteur Institute in France. There are viruses who, when they go into cells, seem to make the cell sticky so that it adheres to the cell next to it. And the whole idea of that is that when the virus is done with its meal in that cell, it has an easy meal waiting right next door. And so these viruses make these cells coagulate, and there's an exchange there. Well, guess what genes do the same thing in mammals? The ones that form placentas. Placentas seem to have come from that kind of genetic material. And there are two genes that seem to activate, and you know what a placenta is. A placenta is the lining between a mother and the baby that gives nutrients to the baby and takes waste products away from the baby. And there's also a lot going in on there for immunity so that the mother doesn't reject the baby and so that the baby is also healthy. So it's, to say that it's simple is misleading. It's not simple at all. It's very complicated, and God had to be behind it. But the exact genetic material looks like it came from a virus. And when scientists have removed those two genes in mice, the mice are unable to have babies at that point. They can mate, they can produce sperm and eggs, but there's no placenta, so they can't do it. So it seems like God might have used viral material to have mammals arise on the earth. And I know that sounds very far-fetched, but it's what the evidence seems to tell us. In the human brain and other brains, there are capsids. Remember capsids, which are the casing of the virus? There are things that look just like capsids, and they enclose little globs of protein, just like in a virus. They look like a virus and they act like a virus. But what they do is they transfer memory from one area, one neuron to another. And it seems like this is viral technology that's been implanted into modern people. It's now part of our DNA. It's not viruses infecting us and making it happen, but it seems like that's where the technology came from. Many of the genes that differentiate humans from the DNA of gorillas and chimpanzees and orangutans are these same HER viruses. Now, what do we make of all this? By the way, I don't know if you read the story that the San Diego Zoo has given the vaccine to its gorillas and orangutans and bonobos. It turns out that they caught COVID from one of their keepers, that it not only can go from other animals to humans, but it can go from humans to other animals. So there's enough, they didn't use, by the way, they didn't take vaccines from humans to give it to them. It's a special veterinary vaccine that was used. But I just thought it was interesting because of the genetic, how similar some of the genes are. Well, I have a modest proposal. And there's no way to verify this, except I'm not the first person to think of it. And I'm not, there are people who don't even believe in God who have come up with this concept before. And we know that before Genesis 1, there was a sequence of life. We know that as life grows, it changes and differentiates, and then there are mass extinctions. It seems like that's how God controlled how life grew. And, you know, when we first meet God in the book of Genesis, he's still doing mass extinctions. It's something that he does. In Genesis 6, I mean, the earth is in the state that it is because there's been a mass extinction that might not have been caused by him. But when you get to Genesis 6, what is the story of Noah's Ark? It's not just cute animals in a boat. It's a story of mass extinction. And God says, you know, that's the way I've done it, but I'm not going to do it that way anymore. I'm going to set a sign for myself, and I'm going to change at this point. So God is no stranger to that kind of thing. The human genome has echoes of ancient history. Adam was created thousands of years ago, but the blueprint that's in Adam has echoes of ancient history. And I have to think that, you know, there were hominids beforehand, and that God had blueprints. And even though Adam was a one-off and a new creation, that some of the DNA, some of the code that was used to make Adam still reflects what had been going on in all those years before. And that's why it seems to cross over. You know, we have that trouble. People say, well, it can't have started 6,000 years ago. Well, it turns out it can, but only if you use the old technology to do it, and that God had already developed a blueprint. Now, I don't know if you understand the phrase talking through my hat. That's what I'm doing right now. I'm making this up as I go, but I'm using evidence to do it. God works in proteins. He had the recipe. How did God change from one life form to another? How did he do it? How did he go from a small organism to a big organism even? How do you make those changes? Well, eventually he will tell us. But what if you had a small tool? What if you had genetic material that you could engineer and that would insert itself into the DNA of reproductive cells and make those changes? And so it has occurred to me to wonder if viruses weren't one of the tools that God used to make life change, to make life come to the point where he could create a tabernacle that was fitting for the people who would become his sons and daughters later on. And there are, I mean, I can give you the quotes. I won't take the time to read them right now, but there are scientists who came up with this theory in the 1970s. So it's not brand new, and it's not original to people in God's church. The natural world is a messy place. When I was standing on the wrong side of the room today, I felt funny. I'm sitting over there. Usually I sit over there. It was good for me to get a new perspective. But when I stood up to sing hymns, I got excited because, you know, you stand here and you see the hymn lyrics here. But what you don't realize is those things don't happen themselves. There's what we call the finger of Lisa Scapura. And I'm 2 rows behind her, and I can see the finger of Lisa Scapura. And when I see the finger of Lisa Scapura, I know when those are going to change. I can get kind of excited about that that's the finger of Lisa Scapura making that happen. Well, when I look at the history of chromosomes and the march of life, and I see what we can find in there, I get excited because I feel like I'm seeing the very finger of God. And that maybe viruses should make us wonder if that's what they weren't created for in the first place. And that all these other things are just ways that God found to use them because they're very useful things. Viruses originally seem to have been meant to help organisms survive. But today we know them chiefly as a vector of misery and death. There's no doubt about that. Was it supposed to be that way? Well, yes. Seems to me the answer is both. I mean, God named one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse in the future story that's going to come. He named it pestilence, but you might as well just call it virus. I mean, that's what all these pestilences are. So you could say that one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse has that name. It was not supposed to always be that way. Yes, they were apparently made as launchable weapons, but immune systems were supposed to counterbalance the plethora of pathogens in the world. That's the way it's supposed to work. And normally that's the way that it does work. On top of that, when God made your parents many millennia ago, he put them in a garden. He gave them protection. And not just put them in a garden that separated them from the virus-laden world, but he gave them rules. He gave them very clear rules, which we understand, things like quarantines and clean and unclean animals and hygiene and things like that. And so there was always supposed to have been a balance there. Now the world thinks those rules are quaint and pointless, and look where we are. So things have gotten out of hand. We've clogged the world with substances that disarm our immune systems, and we live in worlds that are conducive to plagues at this point, you know, with all the travel back and forth and the strange markets of animals that people eat in different places. When viruses rage through the world, it might give you little comfort to think of them as an echo of the way that God began the ancient living world. But that is what they are in one respect. Viruses can be terrible and viruses can be beautiful. And I hope that's what you remember from this message today. There were very few scriptures. I know we have a gentleman who's here for the first time, and I already talked to him and I said, please don't judge our church by today. I said, please come back next week and hear a real sermon with real scriptures, because our sermons, you know, our speakers use scriptures quite a bit. I consider the evidence of the real world to be a kind of scripture. And I want everything to coincide with scripture. And if you have any questions, I would love to talk to you about this kind of thing. I get very excited about it. I do want to give you, in closing, 2 pieces of information, which is 2 articles that came out this month that you might find very helpful. They were written, as I said, for popular consumption. They're very informative, but they also left me just marveling at how wonderful these organisms are. And one is in the current National Geographic. I have a copy of it with me if you want to see it. The pictures alone are worth reading the article, but it's called How Viruses Shape Our World by David Quammen, and it's the February 2021 National Geographic. The other article was in the New York Times on February 26th, and maybe like me, when you see an article with the word coronavirus, you tend not to read it, but this one is uplifting. This one's amazing. It's called The Secret Life of a Coronavirus, and Carl Zimmer is not only a science writer, but he's a popular science writer. He makes things easy for you and I to understand. Viruses, are they good or bad? I'll let you be the judge.